Yeah, in fact, some of the larger companies, Sanjay, were sort of supportive because a lot of that regulatory burden serves as a moat and keeps out some of the younger companies, more independent programmers. So you got to be very careful about discouraging that. I want to do everything I can to let 1,000 flowers bloom.
You asked the question of how the approach we're taking to regulate AI. I might, if I may, change the question a bit, which is what are we doing to make sure AI can thrive in the state of Connecticut? And then how are we monitoring to see if there are adverse consequences, perhaps unintended adverse consequences, to make sure we're thoughtful about regulation, possible regulation?
We're rolling out AI instruction at some of the earliest grades. I got to work hard, working with Dan, working with workforce, make sure I had the right people able to teach it. I want people thinking creatively about how they use artificial intelligence.
So to list the four largest sectors in our economy, you said them correctly. It's finance and insurance. Finance is becoming fintech. Insurance is becoming insurtech. Advanced manufacturing, which for us is really the supply chains and our primes in support of our national defense. Look, if we can't get AI right in the applications around our national defense, we're going to have a national defense problem.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Regulating AI podcast. I'm your host Sanjay Puri, and we are delighted to have you join us for what promises to be an insightful conversation about artificial intelligence, governance, and innovation. At Regulating AI, we engage with policymakers, industry leaders, and civil society champions to work towards a vision of global AI policies that balance innovation and responsibility. Today, we are incredibly honored to welcome the 89th Governor of Connecticut, Ned Lamont, who's currently serving his second term after being reelected in 2022. Governor Lamont really brings a fascinating blend of public service and entrepreneurial experience to the table. Before taking office, he founded a successful telecom company that served over colleges, 400 college campuses nationwide, and taught as an adjunct professor of political science and philosophy at Central Connecticut State University. Joining the governor today also is Dan O'Keefe, Connecticut's Department of Economic Development Commissioner, who has been instrumental in implementing the state's vision for AI development and regulation. Governor Lamont, Commissioner O'Keefe, thank you for both being here today. We get two for the price of one. So a real pleasure to have you both on the podcast. Wonderful. Governor, let's start with you and explore how Connecticut is navigating the exciting yet challenging landscape of AI and AI governance. Tell our listeners a little bit about all the legislative proposals on AI regulation that Connecticut has recently unveiled. And can you just outline for our audience some of the key elements of these proposals?
Yeah, I'll start off and then pass it on to Dan. But look, Dan and I come to this from a different background than I think most of the folks in this building. I'm in the Capitol building and maybe elsewhere. I mean, as you pointed out, I used to build IT systems. He was a technology investor. So rather than see nothing but threats and risks to artificial intelligence, we see incredible opportunity. And I want to make sure that Connecticut is at the forefront there. I just think AI plays into our natural strengths. We have a very highly educated population. We have a very good university system. We have a broadband access that is, universal. And I just think AI is going to be incredibly accelerating for everything we do from life sciences, the greater New Haven area, or fintech here in Hartford, down in Stamford. These are places where I think I want to make sure we get ahead of the curve. So yes, we're being careful to make sure that people feel safe and that the regulations are prudent, but I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to scare away innovation. I see some of that in Europe. I don't want that to happen in Connecticut.
And then maybe just to add to that, Sanjay, I mean, you asked the question of how the approach we're taking to regulate AI. I might, if I may, change the question a bit, which is what are we doing to make sure AI can thrive in the state of Connecticut? And then how are we monitoring to see if there are adverse consequences, perhaps unintended adverse consequences, to make sure we're thoughtful about regulation, possible regulation. The governor's proposed a bill that will create a fund, for example, to invest in innovative companies in and around AI. We're talking about how we might leverage state data on an anonymized basis, but pools of data to make sure AI can be trained in the appropriate way. You know, the way we think about it, and I'll echo what the governor said about mine coming from a tech investing mindset, his coming from a company and an owner and an entrepreneur mindset. You know, we want to make sure we're thoughtful and that we don't move so quickly that we end up stifling innovation before we can fully understand what we're dealing with. So, for example, I think about innovation in two ways. There's foundational innovations and there's derivative innovations. Foundational innovations are things like, and this is, you know, not hyperbole, the telephone, the internet, the printing press, the steam engine, things that become ubiquitous and propel economies forward. And then there are derivative innovations that are built on top of that. I consider AI to be a foundational innovation. There will be derivatives built on top of that. There may be unintended adverse consequences that we're going to have to monitor and consider over time. But for now, you know, our view of the world is AI doesn't make the illegal legal. If you do something that is against the law and AI happen to play a role in it, it's still illegal. So let's make that clear. Let's enable the technology and the ecosystem that is required to make it successful, including training our workforce. And then let's monitor for any unintended adverse consequences over time that might require more stringent regulation.
No, so I think both of you made some very, very important points. I'm going to just follow up on a few of them. Obviously, one of them, both of you have emphasized, which would be, I think, great news, and this is what we promote, is you want innovation, but responsible innovation. And you want Connecticut to be a place for companies to come in, for startups, for an educated workforce. But obviously, as you said, Dan, that it doesn't make the illegal legal. So those things are already on the books. But there have been some attempts within Connecticut, and obviously you see Colorado and several other places in terms of, you know, the legislature saying, hey, we want to put some guardrails and things of that nature. And people have been watching this from that perspective. Obviously, you have made a very important point, and we have had a lot of people from the EU, members of parliament, etc., come in and said that the EU has gone in some cases too far, where you see companies in the EU, we've talked to companies who said we were moving to America because it's become a little tough. What do you, either of you, say to some of the legislative efforts in Connecticut or in other states that are happening that say, hey, we want to put a little bit of a, you know, maybe a little bit of a heavy hand on some of these legislative issues?
Kick it off, Dan.
Sure. I think you used the right term, which is heavy hand. I think we got to, again, be careful and be thoughtful. When I look at some of the concerns that have been expressed, and one of them is something they refer to as algorithmic bias. The concept that AI and automated decisioning, if introduced to some of these high-risk decisions, things like the allocation of healthcare benefits or you know, whether or not you receive certain state benefits or whatever it might be, that hiring decisions, that those decisions shouldn't be made on an automated basis or partially automated basis because there's a risk for algorithmic bias. Look, I also live in the real world, and what I can tell you is I see bias everywhere. I see structural biases that are humans. And if I'm going to train a human to be less biased, that sometimes can take a generation. But if an adverse consequence, even if unintended, is that algorithmic bias gets introduced, I can retrain that algorithm in an overnight session. You know, so I actually think this might be a path to reducing inequity, to reducing the introduction of structural biases. Now that takes real work, that takes real data, that takes real intentionality, and that's what we're really advocating here, is not to suggest we're anti-regulation. This is the very early innings of what I think will be a multi-trillion-dollar economic opportunity. And so we're just emphasizing the point that we need to be thoughtful and we need to really understand the nuances of what this really means. before starting to do these kind of horizontal regulatory requirements that I do think will suppress innovation. I'm not actually worried about some of the larger companies. They can afford regulation. I'm really worried about the small companies for whom this would be, a real burden.
Yeah, in fact, some of the larger companies, Sanjay, were sort of supportive because a lot of that regulatory burden serves as a moat and keeps out some of the younger companies, more independent programmers. So you got to be very careful about discouraging that. I want to do everything I can to let 1,000 flowers bloom.
That's very true. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
You mentioned Colorado. You may have seen just yesterday, Governor Polis, who signed that bill, came out in support of a moratorium on some of these state-driven regulatory approaches. That's another thing the governor and I have been really advocating for or vocal about, which is this is too big of an opportunity for our country. We don't think a patchwork of state-by-state regulations is the right way to approach it.
So you, Dan, have hit on something very, very important, because when I talk to companies, the governor just mentioned the large companies actually are favoring, in some cases, they call it regulatory capture in some ways that keeps out these smaller companies. What about these? We have an issue where the federal government, unlike the EU, we are not going to get a comprehensive AI bill. So when you talk to California, when you talk to some of the legislators around there, say, hey, if Washington's not acting, we are going to jump in. Now, if you're a small company, you say, I have to deal with California, Connecticut, Colorado, and then I have to deal with the EU, India, et cetera, et cetera. This is going to be pretty complicated for a $1 trillion opportunity, a transformative opportunity, an opportunity for Yale to produce life-saving solutions to diseases that are known to us. How does a small company kind of deal with this? And then the bigger issue, Governor, is how do you balance innovation with responsibility?
Well, I'll start with that if you want, Sanjay, because follow on what Dan said about a patchwork of different state initiatives because the feds are not stepping up. So I'm working with Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, who comes out of the media world and the IT world. He was very cautious and worried about Colorado getting too far ahead of itself, put a pause on things for a couple years, and now he's running the National Governors Association. So I'm part of a small team that's trying to have at least the governors across 50 states find some common ground as we move forward, rather than have everybody do their own thing. Look, it's impossible for a small company to navigate 50 different sets of regulatory structures. You're going to stymie innovation and take people somewhere else.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think companies large and small are baking AI into their business in incredibly fundamental ways. And that's why I made the point earlier about what is a foundational innovation and what is a derivative innovation. This is already ubiquitous. By the way, machine learning, neural networks, automated decision making, that was conceived in the 1950s, has been around in commercial applications since the 1980s. Really expanded in the 1990s. None of this is new. What is new is broad consumer awareness, because ChatGPT made us all aware of the power of artificial intelligence, and therefore regulatory interest. What I'm still working on and suggest we as a society work on is understanding if there may be derivative applications that produce adverse consequences that aren't already illegal. We in the state of Connecticut, I've advocated, spoken to the Attorney General about making it clear that AI does not absolve you of our existing laws. I don't think anyone's going to challenge that. I think whether or not you use the internet or an Excel spreadsheet or what have you to do something that is illegal, none of that matters. It is still illegal. So that's why I think the fact that larger companies perhaps will advocate for a degree of regulatory, it's not because they need it to decide whether to invest in AI. Trust me, they already are. They don't mind it because it is a competitive weapon for someone with extensive resources. And it doesn't allow some of those innovators that, by the way, may threaten some of those larger companies to thrive. And that's why, again, our focus is so much on the smaller innovators, the companies that don't necessarily have the resources to deal with that kind of regulatory burden. If it were necessary and I saw harm, I would be in a very different place. But I'm yet to see it at any kind of degree of scale that requires a horizontal regulatory tier that, again, I think would suppress innovation.
No, that's a great point, Dan. I'm going to come to the small businesses first, but Governor, we've had a change in administration that happened 100 plus days ago. Before that, there was the there was the Biden administration had the executive order, etc. How has the change in administration, changed the approaches that states, whether it's Connecticut or others, have towards AI governance and AI regulation?
I'm sort of interested that the Trump administration, at least in the congressional Republican side, as Dan just referred to, has floated a trial balloon saying, I don't want any states to do anything to regulate AI. Maybe a little bit of overreach there, but they feel like they're in a very worldwide competitive environment, start with China, and they really want to make sure that America has a competitive advantage there. They don't want to get in the way of that. I will say the idea that you're limiting the research grants and going after universities, we could be exporting some of our greatest AI researchers to some of these same countries because they don't have a welcome mat here in the United States.
Yeah. So you were mentioning something about talent also, Governor, because AI needs a lot of things, as Dan would tell you, is it needs data, it needs talent, it needs chips, it needs energy. And the United States has thrived on attracting the best and the brightest, and that might be a challenge moving forward, as you can see, as you said, where it might be going somewhere else. Um, Talking about talent, Governor, I saw that you've done something which is very innovative and interesting. Tell our listeners about, this Yale School of Management. You asked them to come up with AI policy recommendations. So tell our listeners what was that about, and what were some of the most impactful insights from this collaboration?
Yeah, state government, we got a lot of lawyers, so they look at things from a legal point of view. A lot of folks who grew up in politics, so they look at everything from a political point of view. So Dan and I just like to get a wider variety of folks to weigh in. So you're right, the Yale School of Management folks did an analysis for us. I said, give me the national landscape. What do I see in terms of AI and more broadly social media regulation? And then what should we be doing about it? And most important thing they said, and Dan's referred to this, is most of what you're talking about is already illegal. And I just came out of a meeting, Sanjay, and they said there's a bill up there to make sure that deep fake pornography is illegal using AI. Are you telling me you're going to oppose that? And I obviously no. I'm going to make it triply illegal by saying the same thing, yet again. But the bigger point, Sanjay, is I want to make sure young people are thinking about AI at a young age, growing up with it, making sure they have the opportunity to see how you apply it to different industries. And that could start, as I mentioned before, in fifth grade in India, where it's part of their national curriculum. I want to make sure that Connecticut's at the lead there. I want our universities to feel emboldened by AI and get in front of that and make sure that gets insinuated in some of our legacy industries, some of which are kind of old. They're going to be rejuvenated by AI. I think this is an amazing time to be graduating from college. You're graduating to the Renaissance, not the Dark Ages. I don't want to do anything to put clouds over that.
Couldn't agree more. Every time there's one of these large-scale waves of technology, or what I again call foundational innovation, there's a concern that work is going to be fundamentally redefined and that people may lose their jobs. And by the way, that's always been a risk of every one of these waves. If you go all the way back to the printing press, the Ottoman Empire resisted its introduction for 300 years. Now, obviously, it didn't slow down the ubiquity of the printing press. All it did was slow down their workforce. There was a whole industry of scribes that were worried about losing their jobs. Guess what? They did anyway, because when you have these foundational innovations, resisting them, all it does is slow you down and make you less competitive. And that's our view on AI. There may be some dislocation, clearly. There may be some jobs that get redefined but I actually think AI can be an incredible enabler. If you now are paired with AI and understand prompt engineering and how to effectively leverage it, then we can become more efficient. Our economy can grow. We'll create new jobs. That's happened, by the way, every single time. We've redefined where we add value. And so that's why I think what we're talking about here, investing in workforce, investing in programming to make sure we're getting an understanding and trained up. we want to make sure that Connecticut is where you become incredible at AI and not a place where we resist its adoption.
So Connecticut is where you become incredible in AI. It's incredible Connecticut, Governor. You talked about bringing AI, like in India, to the schools. You launch, at least from what I understand, it's a pilot program called AI Academy. Tell our listeners just what is that about?
Yeah, I'll start with that. We're rolling out AI instruction at some of the earliest grades. I got to work hard, working with Dan, working with workforce, make sure I had the right people able to teach it. I want people thinking creatively about how they use artificial intelligence. And now we're going to insinuate that right through our university systems as well. I just came from a university, Central Connecticut State, where they have a new minor. The minor is artificial intelligence. So you can be studying medicine, biology, history, or medieval graphics, and AI will be the minor, so you know how to apply it in the 21st century.
And let me expand it a little bit, because I know this conversation is centered around artificial intelligence, and it's an important topic, but there's more going on here. We're also seeing the emergence of quantum computing, and I acknowledge we're still 5, 10 plus years away. We'll see. Bill Gates thinks 5 years. I appreciate that. Feels a little optimistic, but within our lifetimes, we're going to start to see the application of not only AI but also quantum. And to me, that is the kind of innovation that we saw in the sort of 1960s, 1970s with the emergence of the integrated circuit, semiconductor, and the software layer. It is that kind of a step change function into what we're going to be able to do with these technologies. The reason why I combine all of that is we don't even know what the applications are yet. We're in the very early innings of how this is going to transform our economies and our societies. And so that's what I think we're starting to teach people is not only how to leverage ChatGPT, but also how to think about a world where you can't even actually picture the applications that will be built. We need people starting to thinking about what these kinds of things can look like. That's why smaller innovators are so important. That's where it's going to happen. There was a time where all these large companies, Apple was in a garage. And it's those companies that we need to protect. It's those innovators and those inventors that will ultimately invent the future we're talking about. And that's, again, why we just want to make sure they're able to do that here in Connecticut.
And we're going to come to the small innovators. OpenAI was also in a garage, and so was Anthropic, and so was Mistral. Only 3-4 years ago, people forget. Governor, I think you're at the cutting edge of bringing AI education into the school programs. Some of the civic leaders that we've had on our podcast are concerned that there could be an AI inequity. Will AI education also get to underserved communities? Because they say there is the digital divide. Will there be an AI divide also? Is Connecticut looking at that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sanjay. Look, I'll tell you that during COVID, when some of our kids were working from home, like all of them were working there for that first few months, we got Chromebooks out to every single underserved community to make sure that each and every one of those kids, had electronic access. I'm not sure the remote learning was a home run, but at least we tried to do everything we can to make sure that we're able to level that playing field. And I think that's going to be doubly important this day and age. Look, I learned French. These guys are going to learn AI. That's going to be the language of the 21st century. And if you can't speak it, you're going to be left behind. We're not going to let that happen. And I'll add, I was building cable systems and it cost tens of millions of dollars. AI is a great opportunity, an entrepreneurial opportunity. If you have a Chromebook and you've got a great mind, and you can apply that in a way without the big capital barriers that sometimes slow things up. I do think it could be a great equalizer.
Yeah, and let me amplify that concept, Sanjay, because I actually really think there's an optimistic view of the world here, which the governor just finished with, which is, I come from a low-income background, but I went to some fancy schools. Because I went to those fancy schools, I was able to get certain jobs. I was able to have a certain career. And not everyone can go to those fancy schools. And there's a lot of people out there who are incredibly smart, incredibly capable, but because they haven't necessarily had access to that filtering mechanism, perhaps didn't have as much of an ability to have real impact. What if AI is what the governor just described, the great equalizer? What if now if you have an internet connection, that obviously is something we're working on making sure is available to everyone in Connecticut. But what if you have an internet connection, you have the ability to harness all of that information, all of that understanding, all of that knowledge, and if you harness it well, you can be part of this next economic revolution, regardless of whether or not you happen to have gone through some societal filtering mechanism. I think there's a real opportunity there.
Yeah, and Dan, just to follow up on your point, we've had some CEOs of companies that do personalized education. That's coming in because every kid is different. Some kids might be great at math, some might be great at languages, etc. So I think AI can truly be a great equalizer. Dan, you talked about small businesses, and I do want to address that because we have a lot of viewers who are entrepreneurs. Now, when small businesses think of opportunities, they think of Silicon Valley, sometimes Boston, Seattle, etc. Connecticut is not, from that standpoint, viewed as that. Tell these entrepreneurs what's so special, besides obviously amazing leadership that we see right now. What's special about Connecticut, special in this, as you said, foundational technology that will bring entrepreneurs to Connecticut?
Yeah, and by the way, what you described, Sanjay, I'm not going to dispute the characterization. I think historically Connecticut was thought of the place where rich people went to pay taxes. But I think that perception is changing and changing rightfully so. So if you look post-pandemic, we've seen our population trends accelerate, grown each of the last 4 years. Only state in the region whose population has gone up every single year since the pandemic. And as I travel around the state and I meet with folks who have come in, these are folks that work in a hybrid role, now with more flexibility of not having to commute someplace every single day. They're choosing a place with a high quality of life, high quality of education, high quality of healthcare, sort of the soft and fluffy reasons why I moved my family to Connecticut in 2011. So we've seen an influx of entrepreneurial energy that I think really is changing the face as to what is Connecticut. So the governor and I are working on investing along those trend lines. We've announced Quantum CT, which is a collaboration between Yale and UConn, the first time our two R1 research institutes have collaborated together in a public-private partnership with the state of Connecticut. We've announced Innovation Clusters, which is a $100 million program all around the application of both quantum and AI in our core, most strategic industries. We've launched an Office of Innovation. I sit humbly as the state's first chief innovation officer. We're really trying to promote Connecticut as the first hybrid state and really recreate a culture of risk tolerance similar to what you've seen in Silicon Valley. I think there is a real opportunity here. And again, if you believe the analogy I drew, which is the emergence of quantum plus AI is analogous to what happened with semiconductor and the software layer, that is an opportunity for new economic clusters to emerge as long as we get our workforce trained to take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. So the workforce is obviously the key. For both of you, Connecticut is basically known for financial services, aerospace, and manufacturing. And maybe I'm missing some things. Which sectors do you think how are these sectors going to be impacted by AI?
Keep going, Dan.
Sure. They're all already being impacted by AI. So to list the four largest sectors in our economy, you said them correctly. It's finance and insurance. Mm-hmm. Finance is becoming fintech. Insurance is becoming insurtech. Advanced manufacturing, which for us is really the supply chains and our primes in support of our national defense. Look, if we can't get AI right in the applications around our national defense, we're going to have a national defense problem. And the fourth largest sector is healthcare, and healthcare is getting fundamentally redefined, within biotech. I think quantum, which theoretically has the ability to really model what happens in our universe and in our bodies, that's going to have fundamental implications for drug discovery. And AI is going to allow us to understand the proliferation of data that comes from those new research approaches. So I actually think we are in an incredible position, because we do have these core sectors, all of which are poised to be fundamentally redefined and accelerated by these technology trends.
So all of them are going to get transformed fundamentally. What about some mid-career employees who might be sitting in some of these companies who are going to get impacted? Have you thought what would happen from a transition, as I think we talked about, there will be some kind of changes. I don't want to use the word displacement, but there are people who'd be in mid-career positions out there. Any thoughts in terms of what Connecticut should be doing, or what the company should be doing for them?
Look, we can talk a lot about training, but you got to remember AI is a tool. And I think having that experience and wisdom and imagination to ask the right questions will always be the guiding star of AI. And I think that's the human element there. And I think some of those mid-career guys have got to stop being threatened by AI and realize what they bring in terms of how to make it apply to their industry even better. I'll also say something else that's a little contradictory to this sort of euphoric optimism maybe heard, but we're trying to I'm trying to get the smartphones out of the schools, at least for K through 8 kids. I think it's not AI. I think that is an entertainment that really can take a dark turn and send some of these kids down a rabbit hole. We're putting in place more parental controls for parents for kids under 16 to make sure they don't have willy-nilly access to some of these apps that can really have a negative impact. So the human element is always going to be there, but don't blame AI for this. Let's make sure that we use it to the best of our ability.
No, that's very true. These cell phones can be a great asset, but can also be a great challenge. Dan, from your background from a venture capital standpoint, I mean, what from a venture capital standpoint, how do you see them leveraging investments in AI communities, and what role do you see for Connecticut's venture capital community in growing the state's AI ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I mentioned at the outset the governor's bill. One of the components of it is creating a $50 million venture capital fund inside Connecticut Innovations, which is our state's venture capital fund, been around for over 30 years. Again, I go back to my investing career, and I didn't know it at the time. I kind of lived through it, but if I look back at my 25-year career in investing, I lived through waves. I lived through a wave that was originally client server at the very beginning, to the impact of the consumer internet, which was the connectivity of all of those clients and servers. Then the mobile internet, which was bigger still because it was based on the ubiquity of connectivity that was the consumer internet. And now what we're seeing with AI, each wave was larger because it was based on the network before it. And I think that creates incredible opportunity to just get more efficient as a society, to allow our companies, both large and small, to really grow and accelerate and be more productive. And I think it's a real opportunity for our populace, to take advantage of a new set of skills to grow careers at a more accelerated rate. So I loved my career in investing, but I invested in 5-year terms. I think of this job now as still a career in investing. I'm just now trying to think in 50-year terms, really think about what the future could look like, really think about where Connecticut has true comparative advantage, and invest in the areas where we have strengths and chip away and work in the area where we have weaknesses, things to work on. And that I find incredibly interesting, and I've never been more excited about where we are.
No, that's very important. Governor, from a state standpoint, is there anything from a federal standpoint that any guidance on AI policy or AI infrastructure, what they're doing would be helpful to you? Because a lot of members of Congress, Senate listen to us. So this will be an opportunity for you to kind of tell them if there's any guidance, input, or assistance that would be needed for Connecticut or other states, not just Connecticut.
Look, I think when it comes to putting in some broad guardrails, it's much better done at the federal level. And them being absent is creating this hodgepodge of other state initiatives. But more importantly, when it comes to the investments we made, look, the infrastructure bill passed 5 years ago, transformative in terms of transportation. We've got to do the same thing in terms of AI, in terms of those quantum computing centers. Make sure that they're distributed. Make sure people, regardless of their economic background, have access to the tools they need to get maximum value out of this. What Dan and I believe in when it comes to the state of Connecticut is I want everybody to have access to that garage because I think that's where the best new ideas for AI are going to come from. You got those big old tech companies out there in California. We've got the garages here. We'll give you a little bit of that startup capital. We got some great academic institutions. It will get you that apprentice program, that entree into some of these legacy businesses we have so you can help jumpstart where they want to go. That's where I think the states can take the lead. And I think that's the limited role of the federal government.
So the garage, I think, is that's going to be our headline for the show. Connecticut offers you the garage. I think, Governor, that's fantastic out there. But other governors who are listening to you, because some of you really are at the cutting edge in terms of what you're doing. What lessons are there for other governors or other states out there? And we talk to a lot of governors, attorney generals, etc.
I think legislators, by definition, are responding to the fears that a lot of their constituents have. This building is loaded with people that say that all the negatives that AI could represent, and they want to put up one road barrier after another. And I'd like to think that governors have to step up, have a little wider lens on things, maybe look a little further down the road, and make sure they realize not only it's important to their state, but it's also important to their constituents to give them the very best opportunity. Look, we lost a generation or two of manufacturing jobs, Sanjay. They went down to the Sun Belt, they had labor or salaries, things like that. I'm going to make sure the next generation of jobs, which are AI related, stay right here in Connecticut. I think this is going to be a place of opportunity. It's pretty good because they call us the land of steady habits, but that's going to be a loser's motto if that's our attitude towards the AI.
The only steady habit we have is continual innovation.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. I think there is a tremendous opportunity that exists out there in Connecticut. Dan, in terms of startups and the innovation that's happening in AI. I mean, every day there's something new. There's reasoning models, multimodal, etc. Governor talks about legislators. One of the biggest questions that legislators ask us on the show is, how do I keep up? I'm a legislator. I'm sometimes dealing with border security, this issue, that issue. How do I keep up with constant innovation that's happening and making sure the guardrails are there, etc., and which is sometimes tough. Any suggestions for the legislators who are listening to this?
Yeah, look. Here's the cold, hard reality. You can't. You can't possibly keep a pace with everything you just described at the pace that this innovation is happening. It's an impossibility. And actually, I think, frankly and honestly, I think it's a mistake if government tries to forward regulate a rapidly evolving category. And that's why I just keep encouraging all my friends in the legislature to focus on outcomes rather than inputs. Rather than trying to regulate the risk of something happening before it has actually emerged. That to me is you're regulating the boogeyman. It doesn't exist yet. So what I just keep trying to keep everyone focused on is let's look at derivative applications of the innovation itself. So let me give you a concrete example. There's a view, which by the way I share, that we should have been more forward-footed in regulating social media. And while I share that view, as we didn't know the impact it's going to have on our kids or our political discourse, et cetera. What I keep trying to remind folks is social media was actually not the innovation. It was the derivative. It was the derivative of what was the core innovation, which was the ubiquity of the consumer internet. That was what allowed social media to even become a category. And so when I talk about AI, I'm talking about the foundational innovation. We need to focus on derivative applications of that foundation. And if there are adverse consequences, focus on outcomes. And if there are outcomes, let's be front-footed when they emerge. If something gets created that isn't illegal but should be, let's be logical about it. I'm just trying to keep us from trying to prescriptively and proactively regulate something so far in advance that we end up just the only outcome is an adverse impact on our economic progression. That would be the worst thing for our society.
And Sanjay, I'll give you a cheeky answer to your question about how legislators can keep up in a world that's changing so fast. Ask ChatGPT. Ask Gemini. Ask Perplexity. They'll give you some answers and then they'll prompt other questions.
Well, ask the AI what's happening with AI. That's a fantastic answer, Governor. Uh, Finally, Governor, I sit about 20 minutes away from what we call Data Center Alley here in Loudoun County, where you just go data center after data centers. And that's now the big investment issue that is out there. Has Connecticut been able to attract or is looking to attract? Because it seems like there's hundreds of billions, hundreds and hundreds of billions that's being invested in data centers.
You start.
Yeah, sure. Look, I need to add a nuance. And what you're describing is mega scale data centers for enterprise applications.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Meta, Perplexity, all the AI companies
Mm-hmm.
that I just mentioned need. And for those to thrive or to be viable, you need a couple things. You need a significant amount of land, and you need low energy costs. Energy is comparatively high in the New England region. It's not just Connecticut. It's a regional ISO grid. And land is at a premium. So, do we have data centers in the state? Yes, they tend to be business applications of data centers, not these large scale, mega scale, general purpose data centers. The nuance I want to describe, though, is the importance of compute. So, what we are focused on and continuing to look for ways to invest in is compute resources for our startups, for R&D purposes, not commercial scale applications, but R&D purposes for our companies, large and small, and for our educational institutions. Those are areas that we're looking to continue to invest and support. Whether or not a large scale data center exists within the four walls of Connecticut is not a strategic priority for us because compute could be accessed anywhere. So we wouldn't mind the jobs, we wouldn't mind the economic contribution from a data center, but it's a little unclear to me whether it should or would ever be a priority for us from a strategy perspective.
Okay.
I'd only add, Sanjay, because you asked, the role of the federal government and AI and compute and how do we get ahead of curves? Energy. I think we need the federal government to play more of a role when it comes to energy. Dan just said, thoughtfully that, look, we are at the end of, the pipeline here, so to speak. So we have relatively more expensive energy costs. And that could be an impediment to a long-term compute. Thankfully, that big computing center can be down in Northern Virginia. It doesn't disadvantage us. But as a nation, we got to make sure that we have a strategy because the increasing electrification of our system, we don't have the power to generate it. And I think that should be a strong federal role.
Yeah. Energy is becoming a big debate and big question, permitting, etc. But that's topic for another discussion. Governor Dan, we generally end our listeners like just some quick one-word answers to keep the flow going. So I wanted to just ask you if you're ready for that.
Ready.
Okay, and either one of you can answer that. So, more important for Connecticut's AI future, talent attraction or company formation?
Talent.
Okay. The industry in Connecticut that will be most transformed by AI in the next decade?
I was going to say biotech. I agree.
Okay.
Come on, come up with your own ideas.
So I like going second.
Okay. The most effective incentive to attract AI companies to Connecticut?
Culture.
Both of you agree on that?
I think so. Look, we get you some startup money. I'm going to make sure there's talent. We got the ecosystem here, and that all gets to culture, like Dan said.
Okay, culture. According to you, what is the biggest AI concern that you have?
My biggest concern is that people see the downside and they overregulate just when we're ready to hit the ground running. So I want to make sure that we give people confidence we're going to do this right in the way that AI can make a positive difference in their lives. That's
squandering the opportunity. I think it is such an incredible opportunity in front of us. I worry that we'll squander it just by not taking advantage of it.
Great. And finally, this gets down to the education piece. What is the most critical AI skill?
Being able to ask the right questions. And if you know how to ask the right questions, AI is just a tool that will help you get there. And that's going to make sure that we have the human element is always front and center in everything we're doing.
Yeah. I would say, the liberal arts education system has been one of the real linchpins of the power of us. And what does liberal arts do? It teaches you to think flexibly. I think people need to start to think in AI terms. In other words, start to be flexible with how you approach problems. Think about problems when you're now approaching them with an assistant that is always there, always all-knowing, and helps you execute. It's going to be a new way of thinking about the world.
How do you like our one-word answers?
Those are great. So I'm just tempted because we've had chancellors and deans of large institutions, including one of your own, on the show. This is really both because I'm very passionate about education. We past 20 years we keep focusing on STEM. Do you think this, because of AI now, the shift you talked about, liberal arts, isn't critical thinking now probably one of the most valuable things that, from an educational standpoint, that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, but I'm not sure critical thinking was ever de-emphasized. What I think we're talking about now is an accelerant and an enabling factor. It's the emergence of the calculator, the spreadsheet, the personal computer, all the things that allowed us to take these skills and make them even more impactful. This is one more tool. I still think STEM is going to be incredibly important.
You still think STEM's going to be incredibly important? Okay, well, that's great to know.
Okay, I'll give you a slightly different answer. One of my favorite stories is about Albert Einstein. And when he was studying physics in Zurich, so was everybody else. And he was a very good student, just like a lot of other people. He often tells the story. He also learned to play violin. He played violin for a couple of hours a day. And he said when he looked at that formula, when he looked at that equation, today it'd be that algorithm, he thought the violin helped him reimagine in a way that was contrary to what some of his peers were. So the violin was really key to the theory of relativity. So think about it.
Well, violin was key, garage is key, startups are key, and innovation is key. So as we conclude our fascinating conversation, I really want to thank Governor Lamont and Commissioner O'Keefe. They really make a great, by the way, you make a very good combination. I'm sure you've done this before, but for sharing Connecticut's innovative approach. And really, if you are a startup or a mid-sized company too, if I were starting a company, I would really take a serious look at Connecticut, because what's particularly striking is how it is weaving education, economic development, and thoughtful regulation. As they've said, regulation already exists. What's illegal is still illegal. And recognizing that these elements must work together to create a sustainable ecosystem for AI. And so, for our listeners interested in learning more about Connecticut's AI initiatives, please visit the links in our show notes. And if you've enjoyed our discussion, please subscribe to our podcast and join the conversation on social media. And until then, I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, wishing you thoughtful reflection on how we can collectively shape AI's future and our highest values and aspirations. Thank you. Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Dan. This is fantastic. I could have gone on and on, but I think you have real work to do, unlike me.